I'll
Right.
just let you know people's questions too at the end. So maybe, we can stop talking in like a little less than an hour to answer people's questions.
Sure.
Okay, so we are live. I was probably just talking, and no one has joined us yet because we just went live. So I'm just gonna wait maybe a couple seconds longer before I introduce you so that people know who you are. 1 second. Okay. We'll just start. People, if I need to reintroduce you, I will. So, welcome everyone to Listen to the Stars. My name is Nicole. I'm here with Ryan. I actually don't know exactly how to pronounce your name, but I always say Kurczak.
It's Kurzak.
Kurzak. Okay.
Yes.
So I'm here with Ryan Kurczak, and he is a wonderful Vedic astrologer and teacher of Vedic astrology. And today we're going to be talking about the planet Mars and the right use of anger. And it's very timely because right now we're in the energy of the full moon in tropical Aries. So I personally am very strongly feeling this energy. Didn't really sleep much last night. So we're going to get into that in 1 second. But if you have been watching my channel, this is just a reminder that I'm giving away some free mini readings next Thursday. So please email me with your birth data or comment below the previous video that I posted so that you can be eligible to win. And let's just get right into it. Ryan, I've known you for a while now,
Mhm.
and you're a really great teacher. I just want to say I took your Rashi's course, and it really has deepened my knowledge about the Rashis. I've taken other courses on the Rashis, I've studied them, but by far it was just such an amazing course with information that I've never found anywhere else. And I've definitely been promoting it to people that have asked about beginners courses, and just want to say that and thank you.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
um, I would just like you to explain a little bit about who you are from your perspective. And I'm always curious to know where people first got interested in astrology and why they're still doing it, because it's not easy. It's not an easy way to make money. It's a lot of work.
Right. Well, describing myself from my perspective, I usually find that doesn't work because most of the time people have their own perspectives that they believe in a bit more. But basically, um, so I'm a Vedic astrologer and I've been studying and practicing for probably about 17 years now. I didn't initially start with Vedic astrology. I was more interested in yoga, meditation, Kriya yoga, and that eventually led me to study the study of Ayurveda, which then in turn led me to the study of Vedic astrology, which made a little more sense with who I am because I did study philosophy and psychology in college. And so taking that, it makes a little more sense to go into astrology since it does include psychological factors and philosophical factors. So really, I've been doing that for a while. And you mentioned, getting into the profession of astrology. It does take a while. Um, when I was doing astrology at first, I really was only doing it for friends. And then I started doing it on a donation basis for people who just kept asking. And then eventually, there were more people asking me to do astrology sessions than there were doing the Ayurveda or the body work or health and healing sessions. So for me, astrology actually grew organically in that I didn't necessarily go out and say, hey, I'm an astrologer, therefore let's have a business. It was more people kept asking me to do it. And eventually that's all I ended up doing. Sometimes I think it's a blessing and a curse. Because, like you said, number one, astrology is hard, and we could have easily picked easier professions to go into because not only is it hard to study, not only does it require a lot of intelligence to kind of see things in a certain way, and that intelligence grows by studying astrology. So I want to make that clear that people who study astrology, when you get into it, it might seem like it's overwhelming and that it's more than you can handle. And I can speak to that in spades. For example, when I first got Astrology of the Seers, that book, I read it and I thought, this is overwhelming. There's so much in here that I just cannot even comprehend. But then, 15, 17 years later, I look back and I think about all the stuff that comes after that. And it's mind boggling. But the great thing about it is the more you study, the greater you expand your intelligence. So on one hand, it requires intelligence to study, but on the other hand, the study of it helps to expand one's intelligence and one's wisdom, hopefully, ideally. That's the goal, right?
It's totally overwhelming. I'm the worst. I'm not focused at all. So I'm like reading 10 astrology books right now and like doing way too much with astrology. And so I know what you mean, but it's when you really love it though, you just can't stop. You're just always reading things or watching things and trying things out. And it's weird because for me, because I'm so unfocused, which it's just who I am. And I try to be more focused, but it hardly ever works. Which has to do with Mars in my chart, actually.
Yes.
But it's like sometimes I'll just have these random moments where everything comes together, and it's like totally unpredictable because I just am like one thing here and one thing here, and all over the place. So it's exciting when that happens, and yeah, the studying definitely does pay off. But at a lot of moments within that process, it's like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this to myself?
I think it's okay. I think that, a lot of things astrologers and people who are interested in astrology need to do is be okay with that unknowing that you just described. Because it also goes back to the idea of contemplation and meditation. We can spend weeks and days and months contemplating a particular topic and be in a state of, I'm not quite sure exactly what this means or how it's going to play out in my mind and consciousness. But then one day you're going for a walk and then all of a sudden you get the insight. And for astrologers, for those of us that study a lot, being in that space of unknowing, being able to be okay with that, I think what you find too is that there'll be those moments when all of a sudden 10 different rivers come together and then you're aware of why you were studying those 10 different things. So one of the benefits of being an astrologer is learning to exist in that state of unknowing until, the aha moment shows up, which I think can benefit many of us in all kinds of different situations.
Right. Yeah, I was just thinking about that last night about how one thing that happens when I personally get really overwhelmed and I'm working really hard is that I kind of neglect my spiritual practices like meditation and even yoga, but just like being quiet and being connected to myself. And how funny that is because being an astrologer, and I have a similar path with you with astrology or my tarot card path is similar to you in astrology because I've been reading tarot for 17 years. Same thing, didn't plan on doing it professionally, but people wanted it. And like to do tarot and astrology, like in that sense where people are paying you for it. It's just as important that you're working hard as it is that you are nourishing your spiritual life. And it gets so hard to do that, but that's the piece that kind of brings it all together and, but it's just an interesting reminder. Last night I was thinking about how I just really need to meditate and do nothing. And it's like the opposite reaction where you feel like you have to do so much.
Right. Well, you have to do so much and then you have to stop. It all comes down to the idea of like when you're cooking a meal, at some point you got to stop cooking the meal and you just got to eat it. And it's the same thing with astrology and meditation, that you do the work, you do the mantras for the meditation, or you do the study, but then you got to give yourself breathing room to allow that to integrate. And that's where the aha moments come into play. And even astrological clients, I tell them that when they're listening to a recording that I've done for their charts or whatever it might be, I tell them to listen to it, but then spend some time over the next couple of days simply contemplating what is shared as it relates to them, because it's going to be in those moments where they actually get the information that is important to them versus the things that I have mentioned. It's their particular path of contemplation which makes a difference, not necessarily that exact moment when they're getting it. It's what comes afterwards that's the most important.
Yeah, that's why for a while I didn't do recordings of my readings. I just had people write things down, and I just always felt that the things that people were meant to retain, they retain at the moment they were meant to, without having to like watch a video a million times or listen to a recording. I've since changed that, but I still believe in that same thing where it's like what you're meant to know is going to kind of come up for you. You're going to remember a word that I said or whatever, and that will be the perfect timing because people can get obsessed.
Yes, that's true, especially as astrological inclined individuals.
Yeah, I mean, probably myself,
Well,
but
we're an obsessive group.
exactly. So before we move any further, I just want to let you know if I'm looking down, it's because there are people that are commenting. Michael Reed's here, Stephanie's here.
You say Michael
So,
Reed?
what was that?
You say Michael Reed?
Yep, Michael Reed's here.
Okay. All
So he
right.
says
Hey, Michael.
hello.
Hey, Stephanie.
And a few others with screen names that are hard to pronounce. But I want to let you guys know that are watching that you will have time to, and Ashley says hello. You'll have time to ask questions. You can ask them right now, but I won't be giving them to Ryan until we're done with the conversation. But I wanted to just remind you that you're welcome to post any comments or questions you have about anything we're talking about this entire time.
Great.
So we're going to be talking about Mars, and it was the full moon in Aries. So do you have anything you want to talk about and mention for people just in general with this particular full moon in Aries, not just full moon in Aries?
Well,
Oh,
in general, right now Mars is pretty much center stage, not just because of the full moon in Aries. I mean that does a little bit of that because anytime the moon goes into a sign related to a planet, the energy of that planet the moon is in becomes more prominent. But right now, what we have and have had going on is the fact that Mars is in an angle tropically from Saturn, and those two planets are situated such that Mars is aspecting Saturn and Saturn is aspecting Mars. And that typically is an extremely frustrating combination for individuals because it makes people feel like there's not enough time, that they need to accomplish things that they should have accomplished, 10 years ago, whatever it might have been. But it can also create a lot of stress in people's psychology and their relationship because there's a frustration that things should be a certain way and they're not. And then they end up making choices that cause more problems in their life because of this frustration. So, having the moon in Aries is important, especially a full moon. But whenever we get Mars in such a prominent combination with another planet, another malefic, cruel planet like Saturn, that's going to amplify the situation. So basically, this is a wonderful time for individuals to not take themselves too seriously, to not try to force things, to not look for all kinds of problems, because that's the other issue with Mars and Saturn is that people will often see problems that aren't actually there. And then it comes to that idea of don't fix what isn't broken. And then they end up trying to fix things that aren't broken, and then they break them in the first place. Mm-hmm. So when we think about this, yes, the full moon is extremely important, but also that Saturn-Mars conjunction. But when we have these kinds of things going on, it's also a wonderful time period to troubleshoot problems within our lives, to ask ourselves what hasn't been working, because that's oftentimes where a lot of the frustration will come up when we get these kinds of combinations. So anytime the moon goes into a sign like Aries or Scorpio, Mars-ruled sign, it's a wonderful time for problem solving and troubleshooting. The trick is not to do it in an aggressive fashion, but to use the logic of Mars, to use the awareness of Mars, to see it, and then come up with a plan and apply that plan. That's how Mars works best.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think I might be wrong because I've been looking at transits for a few month period, but isn't Mars conjunct Venus right now too?
Yeah, Mars is also conjunct Venus right now. And again, tropically, Venus is in debilitation. And right now, Venus and Mars are exactly conjunct. Mars is at 1906 in tropical Virgo, and Venus is at 1901 of tropical Virgo. And one of the difficulties with that is that Venus is the planet that gives us a sense of satisfaction and fulfillment and comfort. And Mars is the planet of hunger, of wanting to fulfill oneself. And so Mars is the hunger and Venus is the satisfaction. So when we get these two planets in this kind of situation, Mars and then Venus debilitated, it can show people who then start to have these kinds of cravings that aren't necessarily going to get fulfilled. So we have to be very cautious of our cravings at this point in time, because Mars is going to make you have them, but then Venus is not going to be able to necessarily give the kind of fulfillment that is required to say that was actually worth it in the long run.
Okay. Yeah, all this makes perfect sense for me. So I'm definitely experiencing that energy for sure. And speaking of Mars, so you already kind of mentioned that Mars is logic, but there may be some people watching this now or later on that they know of Mars, but they don't really have a great understanding of Mars. So what are some qualities of Mars? And yeah, so can you just explain Mars and
Yeah, and it's very important to kind of get the baseline of what Mars is, because I do think there are a few misconceptions about Mars, and they're not misconceptions as much as just misinterpretations. So Mars, we have to remember that each planet has a higher function, a more pristine function, a function that's kind of what I would call in line with the blueprint of the way the cosmos would ideally work if we did live in an ideal universe, or if we did live in an ideal solar system. And so many people often think of Mars as the aggressor, the attacker, the cutter, the one that hurts people, that breaks things. And Mars can and does do that. But that's typically only if Mars is in a situation that is not supporting his highest manifestation or his clearest expression. Usually those things happen when there's something getting in the way of Mars's capacity to act. And that can be Mars being with an enemy or influenced by another cruel planet, or that can be Mars in bad dignity, because dignity tells us, is the planet able to meet its agenda? And every planet has an agenda that we need in this world. So when we think about Mars, ideally, Mars is the kind of individual that can be aggressive when the time is right. Mars is like the individual who's the farmer, who all the individual wants to do is farm, till their land, break the earth, do the hard work to raise crops and live peacefully. But if someone comes and invades their land, that individual can easily pick up their axe or turn their farming tools into swords and go fight. So Mars is the protector, and we'll see that in the mythology of Mars. Even in our body, when we experience disease, one of the first responses that occur in the body is inflammation or fevers. And that's Mars coming in and saying, we need to take care of this problem right now. So Mars is about taking care of problems immediately, right now. And that can use aggression. That will use whatever it takes to get the job done. That's how Mars functions. When we get people who are always aggressive, or always frustrated, or always having an issue going on that seems like would be a strong Mars, usually that's when Mars is overcompensating for a problem. So that's the person who feels really bad about themselves. There's something they can't figure out that's broken inside them. And so they take it out on everyone else by being aggressive or abusive to others. But that doesn't mean the person has a strong Mars. The strong Mars is the person who knows they can take care of problems. So they're the silent, strong, quiet person on the couch who you would never ever think that they're an aggressive person. But the moment someone comes in the door and threatens their family, they just decimate them. That is a strong Mars. But at other times, they're peaceful. So I think that's an important thing to remember about how Mars functions, that there is the clearer version, or the more in line with the cosmic blueprint version, versus the frustrated version that a lot of people consider to be a strong Mars. Does this make sense?
yes. And I'm familiar with people with exalted Mars, and if there's any kind of avastas, like Mercury starving Mars or whatever, even if it is like a really nice Mars and dignity, it can be difficult to deal with. It can
Yeah.
be really frustrating because it is a powerful planet, and when you're more of a peaceful person, or don't have an equally as strong of Mars, you can just be kind of like overtaken by.
Well, the interesting thing is that we have to remember is, again, that we want these planets, Mars, Saturn, to be in their right place.
Yeah.
So, for example, if we were in a war zone, would you want your nice, friendly Venus on the ascendant person with you to get you through that war zone? Or would you want the exalted Mars on the ascendant who's might rough you up and say, get your ass out of bed, we got to move now. But they're going to get you through the war zone. Who would you want? The one with Venus or the one with Mars? And that's the thing we have to remember, is that everyone has a role to play. And we have to make sure that we keep those roles where they're meant to be. And that takes us to the idea of dignity for a planet. If we take Mars and we stick it in the sign of, say, Mercury, Mars is going to be very frustrated there because there's not things for Mars to do to put his energy to right use. Versus if we stick Mars in Aries or Scorpio or even in Capricorn. And this is one of the things, take a little aside here if you don't mind. Mm-hmm. One of the things we have to remember about Mars is that he does very well in the sign of Capricorn. That is where he's exalted. Yet, Saturn is not necessarily a friend to Mars. Now, he's not an enemy to Mars specifically, but he's not a friend. And the reason this is important is because Mars's energy is very intense and it can be very chaotic sometimes. But when you stick him in the sign of Capricorn, which is a Saturn-ruled sign, that takes that energy of Mars, and instead of turning it into a bandit running around robbing from everyone, it's like taking that Mars and sticking him in the military so that his aggression can be directed in a certain way. So we have to remember with Mars that we all have this aspect of our consciousness that is Mars. And what we really need to learn to do is figure out what is the state of our Mars and ask ourselves, are we directing that Mars in a healthy fashion? And if so, that's perfectly okay. Just because someone else who is uncomfortable with your Mars says, hey, you're being aggressive, it may be that they are just not in tune with their own Mars. So they cannot understand the need for the power of Mars. So we have to be very cautious about developing our own self-honesty, our own ability to review what is the state of our current planets, and also realize that, as I mentioned earlier on when we did the introduction, what other people think of you doesn't necessarily have to be taken as seriously because they're seeing it from their own perspective as well.
Yeah, that is an interesting point because I've noticed since I've started studying astrology that my love relationships have improved, not because of any other reason except for I'm so much more forgiving or understanding when there's a conflict because I immediately see their chart and different things in it and I know why they're acting the way they're acting. And then I just, get over it or work with it or whatever it is. It's
right.
Very helpful. And myself too, if I notice myself having a certain reaction, I can kind of see why. And if I know it's an area that I'm supposed to grow in, then typically I can try to figure out what it is I'm trying to work through in that moment,
Right. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And are there any specific mythological stories or, anything you can do in mythology that can help some beginner students really understand Mars a little better?
Right. So one of the main mythological stories related to Mars, I mean, there's a few, but when we think about the mythology, there is a Hindu god deity named Narasimha. And those of you who aren't familiar with the terminology, Nara can mean man and Simha means lion. And this is considered to be an avatar of Vishnu. And again, it's half man, it's half lion. And the reason this mythological story came about was to kind of illustrate, I think, personally, the dharmic purpose of Mars. So there was a demon in this mythology who essentially had been given a boon that they could not be killed outside nor inside. They could not be killed during daytime, during nighttime. They could not be killed by a man or an animal. Like they go on with this boon about how this demon cannot be destroyed. And what are demons essentially? Demons are those things. They don't have to be the things like we see in movies. They're simply things that get in the way of our dharma, simply things that get in the way of our path. And they really relate to our cravings, our over fascination with desires that sort of take us off of the duties that we're meant to fulfill within life. And so there's this particular demon in this mythology that could not be killed in any conceivable way. So Vishnu incarnated as this man lion, Narasimha. And Narasimha was able to destroy this demon because he was neither man, he was neither animal. He did it during, I believe it was the change of the day, and he did it on the threshold of a door where he killed this demon, so it was neither outside nor inside. And the point being was that this incarnation of Mars, this incarnation of Vishnu, Narasimha, he was able to find a way to do the impossible. And this is often what Mars relates to. And the other point is that Narasimha was protecting a devotee of Vishnu, so a divine devotee of Vishnu, which also shows us that Mars's power is to allow us to function in this world, to be protected in this world. So again, we can do our duties, whether it's spiritual or otherwise. So that was a bit of a extreme Cliff Notes version of this mythology of Narasimha. But it gives some ideas about what Mars is about. It's about finding ways to overcome problems, deal with them right now so that we can meet our duties. And in yoga practice, we have these disciplines. And the reason the disciplines are there are to keep our consciousness focused on the goal. And anything in life is going to have that same thing, whether you're studying astrology, whether you're studying yoga, whether you're studying engineering, whether you're trying to learn how to be a better relationship partner or a better parent. There's a way that it is done. And usually there is a logical fashion about how it's done. Certain requirements have to be met to be successful in any given enterprise. And so Mars is that power of figuring out what needs to be done to have success in a given venture or in a given enterprise. And that can be related to, again, this story of Narasimha, if people want to go back and read or consider the actual story itself. It's easily available on the internet and otherwise.
Yeah, I've heard it before. It's a really good one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now that brings us to the whole point of this video, which is, so that's like a higher resonance of Mars, but then a lower resonance or frequency of Mars is just complete anger and sometimes destruction, depending on, what's going on with Mars. And I messaged you a very long time ago about this because there was a moment where I was getting really into Kundalini yoga. And it was like a very important part of my life because there was just a lot of stuff I was working through after a difficult time. And one of the things that I was doing in Kundalini yoga was this practice where it was a specific kriya that was used to release anger. And it was very amazing to me that I would feel absolutely no anger just in my real life, but then I would do this kriya and it would just be like this overwhelming amount of anger, or I'd be just like crying, just complete rage. And then the kriya would end and I would feel so good. So it really started to get me to think about, we have this ability to experience anger, and it's typically not a positive thing. Like, people use this in a very destructive way, it can hurt people. But is there a purpose for it? Is there a way to use anger just as that pure thing that it is, anger? Or is anger meant to be something that is transmuted or shifted or transcended? And I thought that you would have the answers to these questions.
Well, I'll do my best based on my experience. And you have some good points there that I think we need to kind of tease apart a little bit. Number one, when it comes to the idea of the spiritual path and exploring ourselves, the greater self as well as the little self, because it's all the same thing. There's an idea that we need to transcend all of these lower emotions, that having anger is a bad thing, that having grief or sorrow is a bad thing. And that, that gets me all the time whenever, I did a video on my Kriya Yoga online channel on dealing with grief. And sure enough, I knew this was going to happen. I knew there was going to be the person who decides to type that, well, if you really knew what life was about, you wouldn't grieve for anything because it's all God, it's all oneness, and on and on and on. And I totally get that philosophically. But as with astrology, as with spirituality, as with everything, there's an extreme gulf between theory and practice. And what we have to remember is that we are in a world where there are all these fluctuations in our consciousness. Sometimes they're anger, sometimes it's happiness, sometimes it's grief, sometimes it's joy. And the trouble arises whenever something comes up in our life and we hold on to it. So that's why in a lot of spiritual traditions, the problem isn't what's happening. The problem is the grasping or the attachment to what is happening. And that can be that something good happens and you want to hold on to it and you want to make sure it stays there. And by doing that, you end up just smothering it and it dies. versus letting it come in and letting it go out. But it can also happen with negative things. Like, for example, if some kind of extreme grief comes into your life, whether it be an illness of a loved one, losing a job, hurricanes, whatever it might be, this extreme grief comes into your life. And if people latch on to that grief causing experience and they start living their life in constant fear of that thing happening again, or if they start living their life defining themselves by, oh, this happened to me, so therefore I am a poor person, whatever it might be, what they're doing is now they're attaching to it, they're grasping onto that problem versus letting it come in like a wave and letting it flow back out, because that's what life is always doing. It's this wave of in and out. And so, for example, an angry person, that is someone who has anger or hurt, because this is an important thing when it comes to anger. Really, why are people angry? Is it because there is just this natural inclination to want to like destroy something? No, people get angry because they're let down, because expectations aren't met, a very Mars thing, because they're hurt deep down inside. And so if they're not able to process that hurt or let that hurt heal, it festers and it turns into anger. And then they start acting out in ways that are inappropriate to the situation. So what that means is that eventually there is an appropriate form of anger. And I'm going to come up with probably the most lame example in the world, but hopefully it will get the point across. So let's say, so I play Irish music every now and then on Sundays. There's a pub around here that I enjoy going to and bringing my mandolin or banjo or whatever it might be and playing Irish music. And that gets a lot of people together who all want to play music. But sometimes you get an individual who shows up who either is not that good or who doesn't understand that they're playing out of time, or that they don't know the song, but they're trying. And you have this group of people who are trying to create something wonderful. And then this one person comes in, and whether they mean it or not, they kind of mess it all up. So what can happen, this happened recently in our group, was someone showed up and they were playing too loud. We couldn't hear the melodies. They were out at time. They were just making a racket. And so what's an appropriate use of anger? Well, we're trying to enjoy ourselves. So an appropriate use of anger would be like, hey, buddy, knock it off. It's not working. So that anger comes up. The problem is there. You verbalize in an aggressive way, shut up or whatever it might be. And then they'll stop. And then you can go back to doing what you're doing and the anger passes. So that is an extremely lame example, but that's the way that something comes into your life. Like maybe you're in a relationship and maybe someone is constantly doing something that just aggravates you, and you can't get through to them by talking. You can't get through to them by using nonviolent communication or whatever it might be. You just have to say, look, knock it off. And it comes out aggressive. But there's a difference between doing that and yelling at everyone all the time. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely. I'm thinking of my own examples. This is embarrassing, but I tend to be a very angry person when it comes to dealing with customer service people. Like I will get and it's so weird. It's like, no matter which areas of my life I can like be the higher person with, if I'm sitting there on a customer service line and it's been 2 hours, I will freak out at people. It's like the weirdest thing.
Did you say after 2 hours?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's 2 hours. And I'm
you're awful patient if you think you're angry. Most people would be angry like that. They got a problem.
I mean, it's just like one of the weird things about me. And there was a point in time where I was really working on it. And this guy I live in an apartment building, and one of my neighbors was having some kind of a party earlier that night. And then they all kind of went out. And so it got really, really quiet. Then all of a sudden at 2:30 in the morning, someone was just like buzzing my apartment over and over and over again at 2:30. And my buzzer is so loud that if I'm sleeping and you press it, I jump out of my bed. It's like the loudest thing. It's a very old building. So it's just like a really old, still working buzzer. So high quality, insanely loud. So he pressed it probably like 7 times or something like that. And I was getting so annoyed, and he was just pounding and pounding and pounding on some door after that, where I could not sleep. And I was really wondering what I was going to do. Like, should I call the cops? Should I just go yell at this guy? And I was feeling such anger and such frustration. And what I did was I just got up out of my bed, walked to the hallway, opened the door, looked at him straight in the eyes, and I said, look, you need to find another way. I just closed my door, went back
Yeah.
to bed, and then the problem was completely gone. And it wasn't like I was so like, throwing this fire at him and like, what the hell is wrong with you? Get out. Like, cause he was one of their friends that had joined the party and then they left and never, brought him back with them, or
Mhm.
they left and then he came back thinking they were still there. So he wasn't a neighbor or anything, you know, but it was just really funny because I was like so angry, but it was kind of like this like very polite expression of my anger. You need to
Right.
find another way. I'm not mad at you. Just go. Like no more.
Yeah. And that's totally appropriate, but it's also okay to be angry about it too. I had a similar experience where it was 2 o'clock in the morning and I go to bed. I'm a little opposite of most astrologers I know. I love going to bed early and getting up early.
Yeah.
And there was someone had just moved in and there was a party going on. And I was not angry in the sense of really fuming. But it was 2 o'clock and I wanted to go to sleep. So I thought I'm going to act like I'm really angry because they'll get the point. So I went downstairs. I made sure people could see all my tattoos and I was looking like I was furious and I pounded on the door and I said, look, it's 2:30. You got to cut it. You got to knock it out. And I was a little more aggressive then. And they just looked at me. They said, all right, I'm sorry. And then they went away and everything was quiet. And I was not really angry in the sense I was not going to stew over that for the next 3 days. So what we have to remember is that there are positive expressions of anger, and sometimes those things can be very helpful for an individual. I mean, Mars has he rules over our fight or flight response, and we have to remember there are three kinds of responses really in that fight or flight response. There is the fight response, there is the flight response, but there's also the freeze response. Many people don't realize there is the freeze response in there. And so the way Mars works, since he is the energy of take care of the problem right now, let's say something's going wrong. Someone is maybe doing something inappropriate to a family member or a child or whatever it might be. A fight response might be to, at that moment, tap into that rage and channel at that person, say, this is absolutely inappropriate, knock it off. And it might even involve restraining someone. That is completely acceptable response. But again, if you're going around doing that to everyone, then you might need to consider if there's something not worked out up there. There's also the flight response, which means you see something going wrong and there's absolutely no way you can handle it or do anything about it. And the best thing you can do is just run the other way. That is also an appropriate use of Mars. And it's not necessarily anger, but it's an appropriate use. And then there's the freeze response. And oftentimes this happens with people who've been in abusive situations where they just go blank. They can't run, they can't fight back, they just freeze. And even though that typically results in some more problems down the road for whoever's experiencing that, we have to remember that that is a response from the animal part of our brain. Because think of animals who, when something happens, they just freeze. And it's like they're playing dead, so people won't pay attention to them. So what we have to remember is this proper use of Mars is that we have to be very okay with the fact that sometimes it is completely appropriate to yell at someone to get someone to stop doing something or to prevent a problem. If it comes out aggressive, if it comes out mean, as long as it gets the job done. That's what Mars is interested in. Does it get the job done? Then that is the appropriate use of Mars. However, if we're going around with this seething coal of anger, and every time someone does just the littlest thing, we snap or we break or it comes out of us, that is when we're starting to see a Mars that is not necessarily fully integrated. So for Mars to be properly integrated, the right use of anger, it is the use of aggression that is important right now in the moment, not because it's based on some previous issue that has not been resolved. And so we take it out on everyone because we're projecting it. Does this make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
It's very, very clear. And just to go back to a point that you made about tattoos, aren't tattoos a Martian thing?
Well, it is cutting the body in a way.
Yeah,
I
like
usually
needles
see it as a combination of Mars and Rahu.
yeah, that makes sense. So it probably worked in your favor.
Yeah. Well, I've got Mars in my 10th and Rahu in my first, so it
Wow.
helps.
Yeah.
You
There you go.
never know, would you?
Um, Perfect. What was I gonna ask? Oh, speaking of just the question of anger and frustration, is this full moon going to bring out anger for anyone, for any of the 12 signs at all? Is that something that could be possible with, this configuration between Saturn and Mars, or just having the full moon illuminating Aries?
Well, that brings us to the interesting idea of transits. And again, that also ties into the idea of meditation and our personal development. What we have to remember is that the birth chart is the snapshot of the karmas that we brought in up to birth. So if we were just on autopilot from birth until now, then we could look at the chart and we could very easily predict what a person's going to do, how they're going to act, and so on. But what we have to remember is that from birth onward, things have happened to us. We've met people, we've made new choices, we've thought about things in different ways, we've processed certain experiences, that some of the aspects of our chart might not necessarily be applicable because in a sense we have exhausted some of those karmas. So we have to keep in mind that the work that we have done from birth up until now will have a very profound effect on how transits affect us. So that's sort of my little disclaimer before I get into the meat of the topic. So if we're looking at our charts and we have Saturn and Mars impacting each other, or they're in angles, if we have Mars with Rahu, if we have Mars in bad dignity, if we have Mars frustrated in other ways, then that's going to show that we have this resonance of issues with Mars, where we might act out in certain ways that aren't appropriate with Mars. And so anytime we get a transit such as the moon in Aries and a full moon in Aries, then that's going to bring more light and more attention to those factors that we have as problems with Mars, whether it's being too aggressive, whether it's overcompensating, whether it's trying to prove that we are right or stronger than others, or just general frustration. Yes, it's going to make that more, it's going to amplify that. But again, it amplifies any kinds of karmas. So for example, if we are an adventurous individual, if we are good at starting new things, if we are good at problem solving, and that is in our chart as well, from whatever various combinations are there with Mars, we'll also find that this is a wonderful time period to go on adventures, to start new things, to problem solve and troubleshoot problems within our lives. Because that that moon in the sign of Mars and Aries exalted is going to bring in amplify all of the good things that people have in their chart, as well as all the bad things. And this is why it's very important, in a sense, to know what the predominant state of the planets are in your chart. That way, when someone talks about a transit, you can know, oh, okay, they're saying this might cause problems. I know I already have this problem in my chart, so therefore I need to be aware of it. So who it's going to cause problems for are those people that do have difficulties with Mars. But what I like to tell people is, even if you don't know any astrology at all, if someone is talking about a transit and they say Mars is doing this, it's going to cause frustration, it's going to cause a sense of that you are behind, it's going to bring out aggression, it's going to make you want to attack other people's viewpoints, and you know that you are that way, like you look back over your past and you're able to see that you have had that problem as well, then more than likely that transit of moon through Aries will also do the same thing for you. But again, my main focus in this particular time period isn't necessarily the full moon, although that's part of it. It's that angular position between Mars and Saturn, and the fact that they are almost exactly aspecting each other. And not only are they planetarily aspecting each other, but they are Rashi aspecting each other. And this is extremely important. Do you mind if I go on a little aside about Rashi aspects?
Yeah, please go on with that, and also let us know how long this is going to last for. That'd be great.
You mean how long is my talking going to last for, or how long is the transit going to last for?
The transit, you can talk as long as you want. I'm sure people would love that.
Okay. That's good. Please tell us how
long
you're going to keep talking. Yeah. Okay. So basically, let's talk about the Rashi aspect and why that's important first. So whenever we have, I was talking to Chane Ayers about this recently too. She's here in Asheville. But whenever we get planets in dual signs, anytime we get planets in dual signs, they're always going to aspect every other dual sign, but they're also going to aspect every planet in that dual sign. So for example, having Mars and Saturn in either Virgo, Sagittarius, Pisces, or Gemini, what's going to happen is Mars is in one dual sign, Saturn's in another dual sign, which means not only are they impacting each other, those energies are coming together and clashing potentially, but they're also mutually aspecting Gemini, and they're mutually aspecting Pisces. So we're getting 4 areas hit at the same time. Whereas if we would have had, say, Mars in Leo and Saturn in Capricorn, yes, we would have had that mutual Rashi aspect between the two of them, but at the same time, they would not have also been aspecting 2 other signs. So this is neither here nor there. It's just for people who are interested in these sorts of things. When you get planets in dual signs, they become, in a sense, more potent because not only are they aspecting each other, but they're also mutually hitting 2 other signs, which could be causing problems if they're cruel planets, but they could also be causing good things if they're good planets. Does this make sense what I'm trying to share here?
Yeah, absolutely. And
right.
I mean, the same goes for in your birth chart.
Exactly.
You have there.
Exactly. So the other question is, how long is this? How long is this going to be going on for? Well, not too much longer. Like, for example, right now we have Mars at 1906 of tropical Virgo, and we have Saturn at 2230 of tropical Sagittarius. So if we keep going, we're going to get almost an exact matchup on October 8th, 2017, where we're getting Mars right around the 21, 22 degree mark, and Saturn still at 22 degrees in Sagittarius. And then that will start to pass. And we'll see that coming out of effect. Let's see, where was it? Looks like October 22nd. That's the last day that Mars is in tropical Virgo, which means then he is moving into Libra, which Venus will also be in Libra at that time, which is very fascinating because we talked about how having Venus in Virgo was debilitated, and that caused a lot of issues with fulfillment. Well, having that Venus moving into Libra with that Mars, that can show people starting to get a greater sense of fulfillment through all those things that they were actually longing for and craving. But going back to the Mars-Saturn thing, that stops around October 22nd, October 23rd. And then we're not going to have, we're not going to have an issue with Mars and Saturn being in a dual sign like that for quite a while, because then in December 21st, Saturn moves into tropical Capricorn, and then Mars is in Scorpio at that time. So the dual sign thing is lost, and we won't have another series of dual sign combinations until Saturn gets back into tropical Pisces, which is quite a few years from now. So the thing to keep in mind is that up until October 22nd, the sense of greater frustration for particularly people who have this issues with Mars and Saturn, or people who are Virgo, Gemini, Sagittarius, or Pisces ascendants, all that's going to start to pass once we get into October 22nd of this year. But it can be pretty frustrating up until that point, especially coming in the next 2 to 3 days.
Yeah. Well, I've personally felt a lot of a lack of focus, but I've been really working on my Mars. So for me, it's like a lack of focus, but also working extremely hard.
Right.
Which is not always a good thing because I need to rest. It's like that. My Venus is definitely not, doing what.
Right. And you do bring up a wonderful point there about the working hard. So, these things are happening in relationship to my own ascendant. And so what I have found during this time is that, yes, there has been a lot of frustration. There has been a lot of difficulty dealing with the Mars and Saturn transit. But what I've also found myself doing is just working like a dog. I'll just get up and I'll start, and by the time I look, the sun's gone down, and I've done so many videos, I've done so many sessions, I've done so many classes, and then I just go to sleep and I do it all again. So what we have to remember is that the joy, the benefit of the cruel planets is they allow you to get a lot of work done. But like you mentioned, you do have to balance it out with rest.
Yes.
It's very important.
I forced myself to sleep yesterday. Like, I just took a nap because I realized I was just literally not stopping at all. And I knew it was going to not be a good thing. I also just wanted to mention that when you were speaking, I just realized how much emphasis is going to be on Mars because we had this full moon happening in Aries, and then Jupiter is going to be switching signs on October 10th into Scorpio. So there's so much energy with Mars, and then even Saturn going into where Mars is exalted in Capricorn. So it's like really a time to think about and reflect on Mars and Mars,
Right.
the individual's chart and everything.
And the good news is, with that Jupiter and thing we have to watch with Jupiter is that, Jupiter's been in Libra, tropical Libra, where it's not in a friend sign. So Jupiter doesn't always do too hot in Libra, although luckily he's mainly been in a neutral dignity for a lot of that transit through Libra. And what we're going to see, so it's October 11th. Excuse me, my thing went way too far back. Let's see. October 10th, October 11th, when we get Jupiter switching over into Scorpio, well, Jupiter is going to be moving from a neutral dignity sign to a great friend dignity sign, which means that when we think about how Jupiter has been functioning, when Jupiter is in Libra, we typically find people experiencing a greater sense of optimism, but in a way, I call it false optimism. It's the kind of optimism where you sort of ignore the things that you don't want to admit are true, and you just keep saying, well, I'm sure it's going to be great. And you keep going and you keep doing it. Eventually you find out, well, maybe not as great as I thought it was going to be. But when you get Jupiter in a great friend sign by dignity, that's when optimism, that's when having greater vision, that's when expansion typically pays off more and it works out the way you want it to work out. So this, you're right, this change of Jupiter into the sign of Mars is going to be quite a good transit for Jupiter.
Yeah, and we're going to get into questions in just a minute, but I do see one now, which is relevant to what we're talking about, where someone's asking if we should see Ashtakvarga points for transits.
Yeah, you definitely should. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you should look at for transits, and hold that thought because I do want to say one more thing about the Saturn-Mars bit that's been going on. So we'll come back to that question. One of the things that can be very helpful when people have difficulty with crueler planets or they're working too hard or they're tapping into it in a positive fashion even, especially with Saturn and Mars, these are natural planets. And so spending time in nature can help to diffuse some of that stress and that tension. One of the things that I've been doing, even though I've been working harder and dealing with things, is I've just been going on lots of long walks or lots of runs, and particularly walking. There's a trail I like to walk on that goes by a river. So by doing that on a daily basis, that helps to take that frustration, it helps to diffuse all of that energy, all of that concentration, and kind of free it into nature, free your consciousness into nature. So one of the things people can do between now and October 22nd is spend more time in nature, in between their work and in between doing what they need to do. And that can help out quite a bit with these kinds of transits. So I just wanted to get that out there. But let's return to your question. It was about Ashtakvarga, correct?
Yes, but I just have a point to make about that, where isn't Mars considered the child of the earth or something like that?
Exactly, right. Mars is a
Really
child of, yeah. So when we think about how to deal with these planets, spending time in nature for Saturn and Mars, it's really a wonderful thing because it also gets you away from people.
well,
Because what's the thing that most people get, frustrated about? Well, oftentimes it's people. So it can be very healing in that regard.
yes. And yeah, so Ashtakvarga, I always look at Ashtakvarga when I'm looking at individuals' specific birth charts and how they're going to be impacted by specific transits.
Right. So Ashtakvarga is extremely important. And when it comes to seeing how transits are going to play out, you do need to see like the Sarvashtakvarga, the Ashtakvarga for the particular planet in question to get a sense of how much support, generally speaking, is this planet getting based on its position from other planets. Because we have to remember that we don't just have one planet, we have an interwoven relationships between all the planets. So by looking at Ashtakvarga or Sarvashtakvarga, when we get higher points in a particular sign, that's just going to tell us that generally speaking, that planet is in a more supportive or better relationship to all of the other planets.
Mhm.
And so when you look at your chart, that's what you're looking at, is how is that Jupiter situated based on where it is from all of the other planets. And that may be different for different people. So I might look and see that, I have 6 points of Ashtakvarga for Jupiter when it goes into Scorpio, but maybe someone else has 2. So it's going to be very specific in that regard. But also with transits in this regard, we have to consider numerous things like Channing and I believe, are getting ready to do a video on what to expect, and generally Jupiter's transit in Scorpio.
Oh, great.
And the things that we're going to look at, yes, it's going to be the fact that Jupiter is changing signs into Scorpio and it's getting better dignity. But throughout the year, we have to look at things like, well, what is Jupiter's Ishta and Kashta going to be throughout the year? As it goes retrograde and so on, that's going to change. What's going to happen with Jupiter based on where Mars goes? Because since Jupiter is going to be in the sign of Mars, every time Mars switches a sign himself, he is going to have an impact on the dignity of Jupiter. And so that's going to play an important role. When we think about Jupiter, whenever we get Mercury in an active in Scorpio or in another active sign such as Aries or Cancer or Capricorn, every time Mercury gets in an active sign, that's going to amplify Jupiter's positive effects, because that Jupiter then is going to be Rashi aspecting that Mercury is going to be Rashi aspecting that Jupiter. So when we're looking at transits like this, Ashtakvarga is extremely important, but you also have to go and look and see, well, what other things are going on to support that Jupiter or not. And you can even take it a little bit further. For example, when it comes to, I believe, Digbala, Jupiter does beautifully in the first house, which means there's going to be a particular time every day, pretty much when Jupiter's on the ascendant every day of the day, that it's going to be even stronger, because then Jupiter will have directional strength in that regard. So there are a lot of things to look at, and I think Ashtakvarga is extremely important, but these other things have to be taken into consideration too.
Well, that'll be really fun to watch. I'm looking forward to that for sure.
Yeah, I hope it's fun to watch. I think about doing videos like that, and I think that certain people enjoy it, but then once we start getting into those crazy details, I think a lot of people tune out. So I'll have to find a way to do it in an interesting fashion.
Yeah, or just do 2 videos, one for the general public and one advanced or whatever.
Well, what I thought about doing, because we've done some of these transit videos before, and we've gotten into the how it works in the Vargas and how it works with the nakshatras and so on. So I thought maybe what we need to do is have the first 10 minutes where we say, this date expect this date expect this date expect this, and then say in the second half of the video, for those of you interested, we'll actually discuss why we're saying this.
Yeah.
So for the astrologers, they can keep listening if they want to.
Yeah, the 5% of astrologers or whatever it is.
Exactly.
But people that are interested in astrology, they watch that stuff and then they become more interested. So it's always good to put out there.
Yeah.
I'm just going to look through my questions to see if there's anything that I haven't asked you yet that I really wanted to know. And then I'm going to make sure I go through and see what everyone else was talking about.
Sure.
So some of these aren't super relevant anymore because you already answered them. But basically, one question I was really curious about is Mars's relationship to the blood.
Okay.
So Mars can sometimes rule the blood in the body. And I was thinking about the full moon, and the moon, usually people will relate that to, women and their cycles and everything. So I was curious to know if having Mars in bad dignity or having a troubled Mars in a birth chart can show problems with the blood or even problems with menstruation, because I was just thinking about the moon.
Right. When we think about the moon, and one of the things that I like to refer to is my book, The Art and Science of Vedic Astrology, Volume 2.
It's a good book. I read it.
Yeah. In the very back, there's a whole list in the appendix of what Mars represents. And so, for example, we can look at, let's see, Mars's indications in the Rashi, or the D1, where we look at things like it ruling over nerves and the nervous system and so on. And then specifically, it rules over the marrow, the bone marrow. And what does the marrow do? But the marrow is what makes the blood.
Mm.
So when people, get a bone marrow transplant, why are they getting a bone marrow transplant? Because their blood isn't being made correctly, whether it be platelets or white blood cells or whatever it might be. So while I typically refer more to, say, cancer, the sign of cancer, and the moon as dealing with like the fluid of the blood. When it comes to the building blocks of the blood, Mars has an important role to play because it rules over the marrow. And so you can see that in the Rashi, but also in the D30, when you look at Mars. It deals with the energy of the heart. It deals with the fire of the body. It deals with pitta. These are things that kind of flow through the blood, or the blood carries. So yeah, when we're thinking about these kinds of transits, it is a wonderful time to do things that support blood purity. It's a wonderful time to help to release extra heat within the body, because especially when it comes to things like menstruation and so on, some say, folklore and theoretically, Ayurvedically and so on, that when there's extra heat in the body, that can cause issues with menstruation and so on. But that's because there's too much heat in the blood, which also can cause skin problems and things of this nature. So eating a diet that is more cooling, doing exercises that are more cooling. This is not the time to go out and do your hot yoga routine or Bikram or whatever it might be. But the problem is that a lot of people who have issues with Mars, that's exactly what they want to do.
Or eat spicy food.
Yeah, or eat spicy foods or fried foods. This is a time to be nourishing the blood, cooling the blood, these sorts of things.
And which planet rules estrogen? Do you know?
Well, estrogen is dealing with the endocrine system. And so again, when we break this down, we need to think about, well, what exactly are we talking about? The moon's going to play a role in that for sure, but Jupiter is the planet that deals with the endocrine system overall. So we can try to come up with specifics about what is the planet that rules over estrogen, but I think it's a combination of things, such as the moon, such as Jupiter, and such as Venus, since that is a hormone that is related more to female aspects of things.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a combination.
What was that?
I was just going to say it's a combination of things, and
Yeah.
that's the point, is that medical astrology is extremely complicated. So we talked about the blood dealing with the moon and the fluid of the moon. We talked about the marrow dealing with Mars. Well, the iron content of the blood would be Saturn. So when you're doing things like medical astrology, you got to realize that there are systems that planets rule over, but then there are specific things within those systems that other planets also play a role in. So that's a really complicated topic there.
Medical astrology is so wild, but I am so interested in it, but it's just way too much for me right now.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going through everyone's comments. Stephanie, could you remind me about the confluence thing? Because I'm not quite sure exactly which question you're speaking about. And Stephanie also wanted you to go through Mars in all 12 signs, but we're not going to have time for that. So maybe that's something that Ryan could do another time, to go through all 12 signs and Mars place there, and the difference between Mars and Taurus versus Mars and Libra, etc. But we're not going to have time for that.
Stephanie, a great book for that is what's the William Levacy's book, blue book. It's got Ganesh on the front. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do know which one you're talking about. There, it's I I can't remember the name, but I can look it up.
Beneath the Vedic Sky.
Yes.
Yeah, Beneath the Vedic Sky, Stephanie. There's a lot of good stuff in there about Mars and the different signs.
And she was saying she recalls extracting her wisdom tooth when Mars, Mercury, and Venus were in Virgo. The dentist was super communicative about the whole procedure, while I was standing there looking at my x-ray and thinking, just pull the damn tooth out and I will be on my way.
Yeah. Well, if Mercury, did she say Mercury was there too?
Yeah.
Well, Mercury in Virgo is going to be exalted, so it's definitely going to give more communication about it. So it makes sense.
And then she was talking about your book called Vichara, which is really great, she says.
Yeah, Kriya Yoga Vichara. Mm-hmm.
So for anyone, she says, anyone like her with a Mars-Saturn conjunction in the 12th should read that.
I agree.
And then Jamie says Ryan talks like a high school principal, kind of like I feel like, or I kind of like I feel like I'm in an assembly.
Well, I don't know if that's a compliment, but thanks.
I think it's a compliment. I am taking that as a compliment.
Okay.
And then she was asking about, or Jamie, I guess, could be a boy or a girl, but asking about a connection between astrology and skill in music, but that's a whole separate topic. Just making sure you guys know I'm not ignoring you. Um, let's see. What if Mars is not well placed in D1, but in Navamsha it falls under the Pushkara Navamsha?
Well, whenever you get Mars in difficult situation in the D1, but it's better in the D9, this is where it gets kind of complicated in regards to the Vargas, because each Varga represents something in particular. And there's a particular process called Vimshopak where we look to see how is the planet doing throughout all of the Vargas. And so really what you want to be looking at is not necessarily just Mars in the D9. You want to see how is it functioning through as many of the Vargas as you can find, because the better the dignity throughout all of the Vargas, that shows you that you're going to be able to use that Mars generally in a better way, in harmony throughout all the areas of your life. So when we think about Mars in the D9, what that's going to tell us is that more than likely a person's going to have a better capacity to recognize what is specific to their path in life, what is ideal for them to follow to keep them focused and directed and fighting the battles that are most important to be fought within their path in life. But what we might find in the D1 is that whatever Mars rules over as a house lord, or whatever house Mars might be in, the person might have specific problems with that area of life. So for example, if you get Mars ruling over the fourth and it's not doing so good in the D1, that can give problems with properties. That can give problems with relationship to the mother, or emotional buoyancy. So that's a specific thing to the person's life, because that's what the Rashi deals with. But if we think about how the person directs their life with their purpose, they might find that Mars being in a good situation in the D9 allows them to, despite the fact that they have these other little problems, that they're still able to stay the course and fight the fights and be logical about what they're meant to do with their path.
Right. That makes complete sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So unless anyone has any other questions, I think we should end here because Ryan has other things to do today.
A lot of stuff to do.
Yes. Well, we both do with this or the placement of Mars and Saturn in the sky. I mean, I'm just overwhelmed. But anyways, you have 2 different retreats coming up. I believe they're still coming up. So you have basically stay-at-home retreats for people that don't want to pay probably $1,000 to go to Sedona to go hang out and do a conference. Right. Mm-hmm. You have one for astrology and one for Kriya Yoga. So if you want to share some details for people, that'd be great.
Sure. Actually, I got to get my calendar out so I remember exactly when they are. But basically what I like to do are what I call stay-at-home retreats. And that's where I set up a weekend. It usually starts on a Friday afternoon and it goes through Sunday afternoon, where there are 2-hour segments, say noon 2 hours, evening 2 hours on Friday, and then 3 2-hour segments on Saturday. And we look at specific topics. So if you go to AstralVedicAstrology.com.
That's linked below. You can just click on it.
So on AstralVedicAstrology.com, what you'll do is you will find the link for the upcoming astrology retreat. I believe it's on there. I believe I put it on there. And that is October 20th through 22nd. And on that link, there's specific topics that we'll be looking at, such as the Rashis, the signs, and we'll even go into the Vargas a little bit. So that's October 20th, I believe. And then in November, it is the second weekend of November, I'm doing a stay-at-home Kriya Yoga retreat. And that's for people who have already meditated a bit. I've got some Kriya Yoga courses at AstralVedicAstrology.com that go over the techniques and whatnot. And the point of this particular retreat are for individuals who've already studied or explored these things or are interested in Kriya Yoga, and they want to come together for a weekend to meditate together online, to troubleshoot problems, as well as to just discuss the theory and the practice of Kriya Yoga, because that's also, it's the same thing with astrology. There's theory and there's practice, and we got to learn to merge the two. So those are the two big things that are going on this fall.
Perfect. And you're also going to be speaking at the Sedona Vedic Astrology Conference, right?
Right. Yeah, that'll be on December 2nd, I believe, in the afternoon of the conference. I'll be talking on the importance of Shadbala and dignity to figure out just what exactly can your planets tell you in more detail. So yeah, we'll be speaking there. Did you decide whether you're going to go or not? Or are you?
Well, I'm gonna be in Sedona, so I just have to figure out like exactly what my schedule is. But
Okay.
yeah, I want to see you talk. So
Okay. Well, either way, I'm sure you'll hear me talk plenty sometime around that time.
yeah, that's true. And I just want to let you guys know that Ryan is such a great teacher. I took his Rashi course and it was amazing. So I very highly recommend his courses. And he actually gives you homework, which for me, I need that. I take astrology courses all the time, but the homework piece was very motivating for me to actually digest the information and really learn it, because sometimes I just take things in, take notes, and then it just kind of doesn't get processed. So if you like homework and you need more accountability, then
Well, just out of curiosity on that note, with that Rashi's and Science class, that's the first class in a 4-year astrological apprenticeship course. So my question for you is, a lot of people see that and they'll say, oh, the Rashis, the signs, I don't need that. That's so basic. I want to know from your perspective, someone who'd studied astrology for quite a while before that, what was your experience in that regard? Did you find that class to be basic, or did you learn things that, I just want to know, I want to know from your perspective, what was what was your experience since you had already come from an astrological background?
right. Well, I've taken also previous to your course, I had taken a full course on the Rashis before that, like very, very extremely in depth, hours and hours and hours. And your course covered information that was not available at all in that previous course. So it's like your relationship to your understanding, or your relationship to the Rashis, is just so unique. And it's not something that you can find anywhere else, reading articles online or even taking full courses elsewhere. So there's that part of it. And then I think the thing that I learned the most from you is how important they actually are to fully reading a chart, which is not something that I really truly fully understood from reading articles online or from previous courses I had taken, which is really an argument towards the tropical zodiac in a way. So it was just kind of like, it came at a perfect time for me when I was really questioning sidereal versus tropical. And when you actually know the Rashis, and you're not just looking at houses and you're not just like being generic, the tropical zodiac makes sense. And it was just, yeah. So that was kind of a big thing. And if you have been studying Vedic astrology for a long time, you probably haven't gone too in depth with the Rashis anyways, because people kind of ignore them. So
which is fascinating. That always blows my mind.
Yeah, like I used to have this friend where she never even looked at the Rashis ever, not even like once. And I, as I furthered my studies, dignity is so important, and dignity is dependent upon where the planets are placed, which Rashi they're placed. So it's to me kind of crazy. And you see that you'll just do a chart reading for someone. I don't even read full charts. I do like an integrated reading with tarot, the cards of truth, intuition, and the person's chart. I'm getting confluence in all 4 areas. And I've been reading tarot so long that I'm very comfortable with that. I don't even need to use anything else. But all the things that come up with the cards show so clearly, especially with dignity, like having a troubled Mars, for instance, you can just clearly see that just through dignity. So
excellent. Well, it sounds like, thank you. I appreciate the feedback.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it deserves to be shared. So if anyone wants to check out his courses, you have a bunch of them on your website. So it's not just the Rashi's course. He does a bunch of things, and very in depth.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. So I think that was it for today. Unless you had anything else you wanted to add about this full moon. I think, when is the exact full moon happening? Do you know? I thought it was like around 11.
The exact full moon will be happening. Let's see. Make sure we're precise. So it will be happening in 1 week.
And while you're trying to find that, I just want to mention to people that Ryan was taking full consultations, but recently, like he has a crazy wait list. So now I think moving forward, aren't you just taking one question, prashna reading?
Yeah, I've got about over probably 220 now at this point because we've gotten through a few of them. 220 people on the current wait list,
Yeah.
and so now what I'm really focusing on are prajna sessions for people so that they can get their specific questions answered as soon as possible. And it's not about me telling them all about their life. It's just about what is the issue that's going on with you. Submit your question. I do the research. I give you the answer, and then we move on. So I love doing prajna myself. I find it to be one of the most accurate forms of astrology. But at this time, that is all I'm able to do. Maybe in the future, I'll be able to go back to doing full birth chart readings, but that's my focus at this point.
Yeah, so I wanted to let all of you know that. And so I think the best way for you to make use of Ryan's immense wisdom is by taking his courses. And then if you have a question, obviously send him a message.
Yes, and get full sessions with Nicole.
Yeah, just me.
Yeah, just her. And the full moon looks like we're going to be having it happening right around 2:30 today, or 2:30 Eastern time. So you might want to calculate that for wherever you might be, but 2:30 Eastern time is about the time it happens.
All right, so everyone enjoy the full moon. Thank you so much, Ryan. I'm going to stop the live show, but then I'm going to talk to you a little bit.
Okay.
And thanks for coming on. And all of Ryan's information is below, so you can actually follow his YouTube channel for more videos about a lot of great astrology subjects.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And let's see. So I'm